This lecture deals with the Progressive Era, which takes place roughly from 1900 to 1916. We have 4 learning objectives for this lecture. First, we will identify why the city was such a central element in progressive America. Next, we'll analyze how the labor and women's movements expanded the meanings of American freedom. Third, we'll discuss in what ways progressivism included both democratic and anti-democratic impulses. And fourth, we'll analyze how the progressive presidents fostered the rise of the nation state. When we think of the progressive era, one of the things that pops into people's heads is the Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire. So the Triangle Shirtwaist Company was a sweatshop in New York, and they made shirtwaists. Those were the shirts with the poofy shoulders that were really popular around the turn of the century. And they were, as you can see in this newspaper clipping, in a skyscraper. And the owners were so very, very concerned that perhaps the girls, it's mostly women and girls that work there, though there are a few men. They're so concerned that maybe that they're going to steal a shirtwaist or steal supplies that they had locked all the doors except for one into and out of the factory. And this was so that they could search their bags before they left. So one day, a fire breaks out, and the owners who are on the floor above them, they escape and they go up onto the roof and are able to get out. But the person who had the key for the workers, somehow he got caught in the flames. And so because of this, 146, mostly women and girls, are going to die in this fire because the owners had locked the doors. And, you have stories of them jumping to their deaths and firemen, holding the net that was supposed to catch them, holding it, and the girls jumping, and the force was so great it ripped the nets out of their hands, and the firemen with bleeding hands would pick up the nets and hold it again and just try to save these girls and women, and of course to no avail, and you can kind of see the carnage there. And so this is going to shock the social conscience of not just New York City where this happened, but the nation. And because nothing happens to these owners, they're not charged with any crime. They actually make money off of the insurance for their factory burning down, right? Nothing bad happens to them because this kind of stuff wasn't illegal. You were not obligated to provide a safe working environment for your employees, right? You weren't obligated to pay them anything that was reasonable. And so this event is going to lead to the passage at the state and local levels of worker safety codes for the first time in U.S. history. And from there, of course, it'll be eventually taken up at the federal level. But without this happening, without this kind of in-your-face, oh my God, thing that happened, so far nobody had seemed to care. And so the progressive era really focused attention on the social divisions that were in America. Because on the one hand, while industrialization and economic expansion brought jobs and brought consumer goods to people, which was all great, it also brought severe inequality. And this inequality was incredibly visible. It wasn't something that was kept under. You had people living in one-room slums, and, a few streets over on Fifth Avenue, you have these gigantic mansions. And it wasn't just material positions that separated people. I mean, your quality of life was completely different. Your political access was completely different. Your chance for economic opportunity was completely different. And everyone knew this, right? And it was very, very apparent. And so the progressives are a term that we use to loosely describe a political movement. Progressivism, loosely defined, is a political movement of individuals and groups who hope to bring about significant change in American social and political life. Now, this is largely a middle-class movement. That doesn't mean that there are not rich progressives or poor progressives, right? But what we mean by middle-class movement is that it's largely the values of the middle class that are kind of steering this ship. And the reason why the middle class is finally doing this, why didn't they do it 100 years earlier or 100 years later, is because it's only now in the progressive era at the turn of the century, because of industrialization, because of the changes in management types, right, where you could you have the invention of the middle manager, for example, and skilled professionals, that we finally have a middle class that is, one, large enough, and two, wealthy enough that they have time and money to devote to causes other than the kind of immediate survival. So the progressive movement, even though you do see elites playing a big role here, keep in mind this is being driven by the middle class and the middle class's values. If you need to pause this lecture to catch up on anything, please do so now. If you look at the top of the screen, you'll see our learning objective that we're working on. So first, we're going to identify why the city was such a central element in progressive America. So farms are going to continue to be important in the United States during this time period, but they're losing importance. And farms, of course, the family farm and other farms never go away. They still exist to this time, but they're losing importance. This is going to be the last time in U.S. history that you're going to see kind of farms and cities growing together. After this, you're going to see cities growing and farms shrinking. So oftentimes, this kind of gets remembered as the golden age of American farming. This is when American agriculture is expanding as opposed to contracting. You have families pouring into the Great Plains and beginning farms, and these farms are relatively successful. That being said, cities are also growing during this time period, and it is going to be the city that becomes the focus of progressive politics and also of a new mass consumer society. And probably, the epicenter of this is going to be New York City. It's during this time period, New York City became the largest city in America. More people lived in just this city than in 33 states combined, right? So we're talking about a major city compared to the rest of the country. And it was also in New York City that this stark urban inequality of the 1890s continued. You had people living in tenements. Tenements were single-family units that had been converted into multiple family units, oftentimes using really shoddy material, shoddy workmanship. So in other words, say you have a one-bedroom apartment that's supposed to hold one family. The owner would go in there, they'd throw up flimsy walls basically with cardboard, and 3 families would be living in this one-room apartment, right? And so tenements notoriously filthy. There's not adequate sanitation. There's not adequate ventilation. If one person got sick in a tenement, pretty much everyone was going to get sick. It's not unusual for them to fall down or to catch on fire. This is why today cities have building codes. It was because of these tenements. And so while you have millions of people literally living in these kinds of conditions, on Fifth Avenue, you have these giant mansions, right, with fountains and running water and swimming pools. And so that kind of stark inequality was really in people's face. And so one group that is going to try to be bringing these inequalities to light were the Muckrakers. Muckrakers were a new generation of journalists, and they were writing for these mass circulation national magazines. And many of them set out to expose the ills of industrial and urban life. Many of them thought that corporate greed was undermining traditional American values, and so they sought to expose this. One of the most important is Lewis Hine. Lewis Hine was a photographer, and he went into the factories and photographed child laborers to draw attention to this kind of persistent inequality. Here on the screen you can see one of his photographs of this little girl who's working in a textile factory, it looks like. And it brought into kind of sharp contrast kind of the rhetoric of American opportunity versus the reality of American opportunity. If it's this argument that you just have to work hard in America and you're going to be successful, well, I would argue that the 8-year-old working in a sweatshop is probably working hard, but it's very unlikely that they're going to have any kind of social mobility. When does she have time to go to school and learn to read? When does she have time to learn another trade? If at 8 years old, she's already working 10 hours in a sweatshop. And so this was the kind of stuff that they were exposing. You also have authors such as Lincoln Steffens. He wrote a book called The Shame of the Cities in 1904. And this showed how party bosses and business leaders in the big cities were profiting from political corruption, that they're kind of fleecing the city and the constituents and lining their own pocket for their own gain instead of working for the public good. And then, of course, you have the novelist Upton Sinclair, one of America's most important socialists. He wrote a novel called The Jungle in 1906. Now, The Jungle, you could probably read it for free on the internet if you Google it, but it's historical fiction, which means that the characters in it are made up, but the background in which the story is taking place is more or less historically accurate. So Upton Sinclair had gone undercover into the meatpacking industry and worked in there for a year or two to get the background for his book. And that's where this story takes place, in the meatpacking industry. So what the meatpacking industry was, before refrigeration was widespread, was you would put the animals, the cow, on the train, and the train would take the animals alive, usually to Chicago. Chicago was the hub of the meatpacking industry because it was the hub of the railroads. So from Chicago, you could kind of go to every major city on the railroads in the country. And so this is where most of the meatpacking was done. So you'd take the cow to Chicago, you'd take it off the train alive, you'd walk it straight into the slaughterhouse, you'd slaughter it, you'd skin it, you'd butcher it, you'd package it, you put the meat on the train, and you send it off to different cities to be sold. And so this, of course, is not a good job, right? How would you like to say, my job is I skin cows all day? No, these are horrible jobs. And so they usually fell to the same people today that have to take the horrible jobs, and that's immigrants. And so the meatpacking industry was just kind of full of immigrants, and they were treated horribly, right? These were dangerous jobs. They were exploited. They're paid very low wages. They're cheated. And so Sinclair writes The Jungle, hoping to make Americans see kind of how horrible life was for immigrants in the first part of the book. And then the second part of the book is basically, one big long socialist, writing, right? And it's terrible. You read the story about these immigrants that come in, and they're all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and hardworking, and they get in there and they're going to work hard and achieve the American dream, and just the system breaks them down, and the baby dies, and she becomes a prostitute, and he's homeless, and the other kid gets eaten by rats, and the guy's feet are falling off because he's standing in formaldehyde, and by chapter 10 you're drinking hard liquor just to kind of make it through the story. And so Sinclair often says he aimed for the heart but missed and hit their stomach, right? Because Americans read this book and they were like, yeah, dead babies. But what am I eating? Oh my God. Because he showed that, because there was no regulation, the way that they were treating this food was horrible. There were rats all over the place. People would have their finger ground up in the sausage grinder, and they just keep going and leave the finger, parts in there. Meat would go bad, and they'd shoot it up with formaldehyde and stick a premium sticker on it and this kind of stuff. And so people read this and were just completely grossed out. And it was because of this novel that we have the Pure Food and Drug Act and Meat Inspectors Act passed in 1906. Because people were actually horrified about what was happening. And so it was a socialist, Upton Sinclair, who is partly responsible for the first kind of regulations that we have in this country regarding our meat. If you need to pause this video, You can do so now. During this time period at the turn of the century, this is a time of a global pattern of immigration. So immigrants are, this is a fluid time where people are moving all over the place. And between 1901 and 1914, 13 million immigrants are going to come to the United States. And we characterize these as new immigrants to distinguish them from the groups that came before. The groups that came to America before this time period, with the exception of the Chinese, tended to be from Northern and Western Europe. So England, Scotland, France, Germany, Ireland, these kinds of places. These new immigrants are coming from different places. We have more Mexicans coming in, we have Japanese coming in, and from Europe we have Eastern and Southern Europeans coming in, which is going to be very problematic for a lot of the native-born Americans that were already here, because these immigrants looked different, had different cultures, oftentimes had different religions, and so we're going to see nativism rise during this time period as a response. And you can kind of see here on this cartoon how this idea of you could be half American and half Italian, right, was kind of frowned upon by these nativists. So there's a lot of causes for why immigration is increasing, not just to the United States, but globally during this time period. Industrial expansion and the decline of traditional agriculture is going to set this in motion. And there's lots of things happening between 1840 and 1914 that explain this. There's kind of widespread poverty throughout the world, partly because of that industrial expansion. The haves and the have-nots, just like we see in America, where the owner is very, very rich and his workers are barely surviving, is not unique to the United States. You have high rates of illiteracy throughout the world, so social mobility is going to be limited, and as farming ends and you're kind of get stuck in the life of a factory, then you start looking for other alternatives. In a lot of parts of the world, you have high taxation, people looking to escape taxes, or the taxes were so high they lost their farms. And you also have violence throughout the world that people are fleeing. So in Mexico, for example, beginning in 1910, there's the Mexican Revolution. So many Mexicans are fleeing that violence and crossing into the United States. You kind of have a perpetual warfare in the 1800s in Europe. So you have, people being conscripted into armies. They're fleeing that. You have an uptick in anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe and Russia in particular, where you see, Jews being attacked, so they're fleeing that. So there's lots of reasons why immigration patterns are changing during this time period. Now, European immigrants who came to the United States tended to enter through Ellis Island in New York Harbor. It's technically in New Jersey, but New Yorkers don't like to admit that. So they tended to come through there. They didn't have to. There were other ports of entry. Galveston, for example. We see a lot of German immigrants coming in through Galveston, and this is why in South Texas, it's kind of a weird mix, right? You'll have San Antonio, which is a Spanish name, right, next to Fredericksburg, which is a German name, right? And that's because you have a lot of German immigrants, especially coming in through Galveston. But usually Europeans came in through Ellis Islands. You do also have an influx of Asian and Mexican immigrants into the United States during this time period. Asians would have entered on the West Coast through Angel Island. The Chinese by this time are already excluded because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, but approximately 72,000 Japanese people are going to arrive, and they're going to find themselves increasingly discriminated against, just like the Chinese before them. Everything from not being able to become naturalized citizens, to not being able to own radio stations, not being able to own land, things like that. Mexican immigration also spikes during this time period. Approximately 1 million Mexicans will enter the United States during this time. And that's a huge amount of people. That's 10% of Mexico's population at the time. And this is largely a result of the Mexican Revolution, which breaks out in 1910. So by the time we get to 1910 in the United States, 1/7 of the American population was foreign born. That's a massive amount of people. And so, like their 19th century predecessors, these new immigrants who are arriving were imagining the United States as a land of freedom. And most of them came in search of, freedom and prosperity. And whether or not they find it is highly debatable, right? There were some immigrants, like the owners of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, who were immigrants and who had that rags to riches story. But they're very, very unusual. Most immigrants who came here were going to struggle and were going to stay poor during this time period. That doesn't mean it never happened. That doesn't mean there's no Bill Gateses out there today, but they're weird, right? Most of the time, these people were struggling. On the other hand, depending on how we're defining freedom, they may have found more of it, right? And as you know, this definition of freedom is highly contested and highly in flux. And many industrial workers argued that they did not have freedom because of the way they were treated. But if we're defining freedom as, the government is not going to kick down your door because you talked about the president, that's not something they could say in Russia, right? That the state was not going to organize a pogrom against Jews because they worship differently, then that was a type of freedom. So take this for what it's worth, right? They came in search of freedom and prosperity. Whether or not they found it, I suppose, depends on how we're defining it. The majority of them, though, wanted to be birds of passage. And what we mean by that is that they didn't plan on staying in America. Most wanted to come and make enough money to purchase land and return to their homelands. Unfortunately, because of the conditions in the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era, most of them are not going to be able to do that. Most of them will never earn enough money, barely to survive here, let alone to go back home rich. And so the majority of them end up staying. And so these new immigrants tended to cluster together in kind of close-knit ethnic neighborhoods. And this is why even today, if you go to New York, there's, Little Italy, there's Chinatown, right? There's these different kind of ethnic neighborhoods. It's a legacy of this. And their life and work was pretty hard. They endured very, very long hours, usually 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. Their wages were extremely low, so even though they're working those kinds of hours, the entire family oftentimes has to go to work. So the mom, the dad, the 7-year-old, the 5-year-old, the 10-year-old all get up and go to work in the factory, and they still may starve, right? That's not weird during this time period. And they're also working in very dangerous conditions. Like the shirtwaist factory fire shows you, there were no safety regulations yet. And safety working regulations oftentimes are expensive or cut into your bottom line. And so workers didn't. The United States at this time had the highest level of workplace deaths in the world, right? Around 35,000 people died at work each year. And that was fine, right? Nothing was going to happen to employers for that happening. Now, they oftentimes worked in factories and in mines where they did the unskilled work. Any skilled work or supervisory work that needed to be done in those places was usually done by white native-born workers. So the white native-borns did the skilled work, they did the middle management, supervisory work, and it was for immigrants to do the unskilled, dangerous stuff. For most Mexican immigrants, most of them are going to become poorly paid agricultural, mine, or railroad laborers. And just like European immigrants, their chances for social mobility were extremely limited. So if you need to pause this lecture to catch up, please do so now. So cities were really important, not just because this is where a lot of the industrialization is taking place, but this is also where mass consumption is starting to become part of the American definition of life, right? And so this mass consumption society added a new meaning to how we defined American freedom. And partly this is due to the advent of large department stores in central cities, as well as chain stores in urban neighborhoods, and retail mail order houses for farmers and small town residents. What this did was it tied consumers throughout the country together into this one national market, right? So even if you lived on Little House in the Prairie, you could order something from a mail order catalog. You were tied into the market, whether you lived in New York City or whether you lived in the middle of nowhere. And so all of this is going to make available to consumers throughout the country a vast array of goods that were pouring out of the nation's factories. And so, to put it crudely, being able to buy stuff becomes one of the ways that Americans began to define freedom. Can I consume? Can I purchase consumer goods? And if you could, then you were free. And you see this in the advertisements of the time, right? If you see on the screen here, here's primary sources, right? You see the Statue of Liberty being used to sell crackers. What does the Statue of Liberty have to do with crackers? Well, because if you could buy crackers, then you were free, right? So this is the kind of thing that we see going on. You also see a big increase in leisure activities that are taking the place of mass consumption. Before, leisure activities, unless you were going to, say, a park, right, tended to be, or the opera, tended to be private affairs. You would hold parties or soirees or picnics or whatever for your friends. Now this is changing, and we're starting to see these kind of public places of mass consumption of leisure. So amusement parks get started during this time period, Coney Island being the most famous. You have dance halls founded, and theaters and Nickelodeons, all places where you would go geared toward the masses, right? Where you would go and purchase leisure activities. And this is something relatively new. Things are also changing for women, the working woman, right? And it's causing traditional gender roles to change. Traditionally, the ideal, if not the reality, was that women would stay in the private sphere. The private sphere was the domestic world, the world of the home, the world of the family, the world of children. And that doesn't mean she wasn't working, right? Imagine trying to clean your house and cook dinner without electricity or running water, right? Think of how you'd have to gather firewood and start a fire and walk to the river and get water and come back and get it boiling and tend the fire and scrub without water. You know, they were working really hard all day, but ideally they were working at home. Now, of course, for poor women, this was always a myth, right? Poor women have always had to work or they would starve. But that at least was the ideal. But now those traditional gender roles are changing dramatically as more and more women were working for wages in public spaces. Now, for immigrant women, they tended to be confined to unskilled, low-pay factory work. And if immigrant men were paid little, immigrant women were paid even less. So they're kind of stuck there. But for native-born white women, their job opportunities during this time period are going to expand. They will be allowed to now start to become office workers, so you'll see them as secretaries, for example. And telephone operators was a woman profession. And so they're still going to be paid less than men, but new types of job opportunities that were not this kind of unskilled, low-pay work began to open for them, though plenty of them are still in the factories. But the working woman herself becomes this symbol of a female emancipation, right? This idea that she is somehow free because she is allowed to work. Now, traditionally, though, even these newly emancipated women that are working for wages did tend to quit once they got married and go back into the domestic sphere. But more and more of them were not quitting. About a fourth would continue to work for wages even after they got married. And while that is a minority, it's a significant minority and indicative of changes that are going to continue in society. That being said, that you're going to see these battles emerging, especially within immigrant families of all nationalities, between their parents and their self-consciously, quote, free children, especially their daughters, who looked at women who were working and had their own money and kind of led their own lives, and the parents who are coming from more traditional backgrounds that are seeking to control them. And you would see these battles erupt, especially if they were trying to give their daughters curfews or make their daughters take chaperones with them when their native-born peers didn't have those restrictions. And so this also becomes not just a gender issue, but also a cultural one. And playing into, consumerism is this idea of Fordism. And Fordism definitely kind of takes over the United States during this time period. So the definition of Fordism is an economic system based on mass production and mass consumption. An economic system based on mass production and mass consumption. And we name it after Henry Ford. Henry Ford brought the automobile within the reach of ordinary Americans. The automobile had been around for a few decades, but they were very, very expensive, partly because all the parts needed to be handmade. Cars are, big machines that require a lot of skill to put together. But in 1905, Henry Ford established the Ford Motor Company. And 3 years later, he introduced the Model T car. And he was able to revolutionize the manufacturing of the Model T by using the moving assembly line. Assembly lines had been around for a while, but it was Ford who figured out to make it moving. And so all of a sudden you can mass produce these Model Ts. And they become, when you mass produce something, it lowers the price. And so the Model T became affordable for your average American. And so Ford ended up paying his worker what was called the $5 day. That's twice the industry average. And he did this for two reasons, right? The real practical reason was that working on an assembly line, especially a moving assembly line, is a horrible, horrible job, right? All you do is you stand there and you do one repetitive task over and over and over again. All you do is turn the screw, move it down, turn the screw, move it down, turn the screw, move it down. That's kind of soul killing, right? Brain numbing, soul killing. Before, if you worked on all aspects of production, say you made tables, even if you didn't get a lot of money for your table, at the end of the day, you got to see the finished product and you got to feel proud of yourself. Look at what I did, right? Now, if you work on the assembly line, you never see the finished Model T unless you're the guy in charge of polishing it. You just turn the screw, move it down, turn the screw, move it down. And so you feel like a cog in the machine. And you are a cog in the machine. You're completely replaceable and totally unimportant. And so it was kind of a horrible job. And so he had to pay people high to get people to stay. And even with this high wage, he's got terrible turnover in his factories, right? He has a real hard time keeping employees. The second reason he pays more, though, was more pragmatic. And he argued that if he paid his workers enough, then they would be the ones to buy his cars. You couldn't build Model Ts all day and not want one. And he was right. By paying his workers a lot, they ended up becoming customers and buying his cars. And this is an argument that critics of Walmart level against it, right? They say, Walmart, you should be paying your people more because where do you think people who work at Walmart shop? It's not like I got done at my shift at Walmart and I did work at Walmart, right? And then went to go shop at Macy's. No, you turn around and you went and you shopped at Walmart itself. And so they would get that money back and then some if they paid their workers more. In any event, Ford did a lot of good with regard to, putting the Model T into practice, paying his workers well. He does have a very dark side, though, that you need to be aware of, and that is that he is extremely anti-Semitic, believing in international conspiracies with Jews, buddy-buddy with Hitler, kind of anti-Semitic, right? So that's his downside. Questions about this, I urge you to just kind of Google Ford. There's a lot of cool information about that. If you need to pause this video to catch up on anything, please do so now. So it's in the progressive era that the economy begins to shift. And it's shifting away from producing capital goods. And by capital goods, we mean things like steel and railroads, things like that, to more consumer products. And so you're going to see advertising during this time period, once again, linking goods with the ideas of freedom. And economic abundance would eventually come to define the American way of life. And the way that they're defining the American way of life here is one in which personal fulfillment was to be found through acquiring material goods. Personal fulfillment was to be found through acquiring material goods. So, who's an American? An American is one who is happy because they can shop, right? And it sounds very bold or kind of bald when we put it that way, but that is essentially what they're arguing, and it will continue to be an argument, especially during the Cold War, when we're contrasting America with, say, the Soviet Union, which didn't have a lot of consumer goods. So, in order to have the, quote, American way of life, you need to be able to purchase things. And in order to purchase things, you need to be paid what was, quote, a living wage. And so earning a living wage came to be viewed as a natural and absolute right of citizenship. One of the more important people that is arguing this is a priest named Father John A. Ryan, who wrote a book called Living Wage in 1906. And in Living Wage, Ryan endorsed the right of workers to join unions and criticized the divorce of economic life from ethical considerations. He argued that making money should not be the end in itself, right? Making money should be what you use to make society better. The ends don't justify the means. You have to have, if you're going to, American life should not just be about making money, but it should also be about having, ethics and morals, this kind of thing. And so this discussion of an American standard of living offered a language for criticizing the inequality of wealth and power in the United States. Because remember, in the Gilded Age, it was all about the freedom of contract. It was all about being able to make money, and that's what it meant to be free. And here was a language that they could use to criticize that by saying that, there needs to be a living wage, and that the American way of life means that I have enough money to purchase good things. And Ryan was also making the point that unions were good. Unions are the thing that allows that power imbalance between owners and workers to equalize them. And it's true to this day. If you were to compare, if you were going to put up a graph between wages and union membership, they're going to line up. The higher union membership, the higher the wages. The lower the union membership, the lower the wages, right? And so mass consumption comes to occupy a central place in descriptions of American society and in America's future. It becomes to be how Americans begin to define themselves and their society. So if you need to pause this to catch up on anything, you may do so now. So we're now going to talk about the learning outcome, analyze how the labor and women's movements expanded the meanings of American freedom. To begin talking specifically about the progressives, you need to remember that progressives do not denote a political party per se. There were Republicans who identified themselves as progressives. There were Democrats who identified themselves as progressive. This was more of a way of viewing the world as opposed to, say, a political ideology. Now, of course, today that term, if you call somebody progressive, means that you're a very liberal Democrat, right? That's what this term has come to mean today. But that is not what the term means during the progressive era. Essentially, progressives believed that they needed to humanize industrial capitalism and find common ground in society. And many complained about this loss of freedom from factory workers to employers. This idea that, capitalism became all about making money and forgot that there were people, right, who needed to eat and who needed to be treated fairly and ethically. And so progressives wanted to humanize this capitalism, make them remember that there were humans involved, and treat them a little bit better. And so now we start to see this talk about industrial freedom. We can define industrial freedom as empowering workers to participate in economic decision making via strong unions. Empowering workers to participate in economic decision making via strong unions. And they were really up against some pretty heady stuff, right? Everything from just the way it had been done to new, quote, scientific management techniques. So scientific management was come up with by a guy named Frederick W. Taylor. And scientific management was the idea that there was one best way of producing goods, which could be determined and then implemented, right? So there was one fastest, most, best way to produce shoes. And you must produce them this way, and we're also going to time it, right? Once you get this down, this should take exactly this many seconds. And they started implementing this stuff and making their workers do it. And so this totally eroded the freedom of all workers, but especially skilled workers. Because before, say you were a shoemaker, right? You used to have tricks that you had learned over time to make your shoe special, or to this new little technique that only you knew. And now that's gone. You have to do it this way, period. There's no other way you can do it, and you better do it fast, because the machine makes 100 stitches a minute. You better be making 100 stitches a minute, right? The problem with this was that a lot of the data that they're using for this, they actually just made up, right? They made up that it takes this many seconds to do that. And so not only did you erode the kind of freedom, you're totally micromanaging your workers, but you're stressing them out too, trying to have them do these kind of impossible tasks. And this still continues into the modern day. UPS is famous for using kind of this Taylorism stuff. And that's why you always see UPS drivers like super stressed and like going as fast as they can. They get paid well, right? But they're timed. They're like, it should take you exactly this many minutes to walk from the truck to the house. It should take you this many minutes from get to point A to point B. You're not allowed to turn left, right? This kind of thing. So you see this, or is it right? Either way, this kind of Taylorism still continues today, and it's absolutely horrible for workers. And so that's the kind of stuff that the progressives are up against, and why this question of industrial freedom and industrial democracy are going to occupy the center stage of political discussion during this time period. Louis D. Brandeis, who later became a Supreme Court justice, talked a lot about this. Brandeis famously believed that unions embodied the essential principle of freedom, in other words, the right of people to govern themselves. And he would famously juxtapose political liberty versus industrial slavery in society. This idea that either you are unionized and you have a right to have a say in how your life is, right, in the type of work you do and the type of pay you receive, or essentially you're a slave, except your owner's industry. So if we need to pause this video to catch up on something, please do so now. In addition to just the American political parties of Republicans and Democrats, there were other political parties during this time period, particularly the American Socialist Party. So socialism today is starting to change slightly thanks to candidates like Bernie Sanders. But for most of the 20th century, socialism was a bad word, right? And when somebody called an American a socialist, most of them couldn't define what that meant, right? Most Americans couldn't define what socialism is. Instead, what they were saying was that you were evil, you were bad, you were somehow un-American, though they didn't quite know why, right? They don't quite know what that definition is. But America did have a socialist party. It was founded during the Progressive Era in 1901, and it was led by a labor activist named Eugene V. Debs. And so for a long time, being a socialist was okay. It wasn't mainstream, it wasn't, kind of normal, but it wasn't anything dangerous or scary either. You would just be kind of looked at as somebody who had some quirky political beliefs. The event that really kind of sets socialism on the path to being something bad and dangerous and un-American is going to be the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, where the Bolsheviks, seized power, they murdered the Tsar, they set up the Soviet Union. That's the thing that gets the ball rolling, and of course, once the Cold War starts, it's completely over, right? This idea that socialism is acceptable. But for a while, for almost 2 decades, it was, okay to be a socialist. It was a little weird, but it was okay. So the Socialist Party platform called for free college education, improved labor conditions, and public ownership of railroads and factories. So again, this is not communism. Communism means no private property at all. That's not what socialists were saying. They were saying that things like factories and railroads should be publicly owned, that people are entitled to a free college education, and that workers needed to be treated fairly. Radical, I know. In 1912, this was not a majority party ever, right? In 1912, the party has around 150,000 members. So it's a minority party, but it's not insignificant. And socialism did have the support of a lot of labor unions from the American Federation of Labor, and it flourished in diverse communities throughout the country. So typically, the more diverse your society was, the more support socialism had. So, for example, New York City is going to elect Meyer London to Congress. So we did have a socialist elected to Congress by New York City. So this happens, socialists enjoyed some success at the national level in New York City, but especially on the local level, you'll see local officials elected from the Communist Party. But of course, Eugene V. Debs was socialism's loudest voice. He typically, in his speeches, would link together the ideas of freedom and self-governance and equality into a pretty compelling message. He also was going to run for president in 1912 on the socialist ticket, and he wins 6% of the total vote, which, again, not a majority, but 6% of the total vote of the United States is not insignificant either. So if we need to pause this video to catch up on something, please do so now. The Progressive Era is a time of growth for labor unions. We will see labor union membership triple after the depressions of the 1890s. Probably the most important labor union during this time period is the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, which was led by a man named Samuel Gompers. And Gompers sought to forge closer ties with forward-looking corporate leaders who were willing to deal with unions as a way to stabilize employee management relations. As you guys know, the turn of the century is a period of violent strikes. And so Gompers is making the argument that, hey, if you don't want this violence taking place here, if you want your workers to be happy and to work hard for you, then the way to do it is through a union. Now, this kind of worked with some of them, but keep in mind most employers will remain extremely anti-union, and they will see them as, quote, intolerable interference with their authority, unquote. In other words, nobody's going to tell me how to run my business, is how they saw it. The AFL itself represented skilled industrial and craft laborers. They were almost all white, they were male, and they were almost always native born. So this was a very exclusionary union, unlike the Knights of Labor from before, who welcomed in immigrants, who welcomed in women, who welcomed in unskilled labor. This is going to be a labor union for skilled workers who were white, male, and native born. Now, a group of unionists who rejected the AFL's exclusionary policies was the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW. Their nickname was the Wobblies. This was part union and part advocate for a workers' revolution that would lead to anarchy. So these are about anarchists. But for them, solidarity was the guiding principle. This idea of class consciousness, that we needed to recognize that we were all workers and act accordingly and not be divided up amongst kind of these, in their view, artificial distinctions between man and woman, between immigrant and native born, between white and black, that kind of thing, right? They saw this as, we're in this together, we need to support each other. And so they're going to be trying to mobilize everybody, skilled and unskilled, immigrant, native born, etc. And so because immigrants, those new immigrants, were such a predominant part of the industrial workforce during this time period, oftentimes employers would use this as a way to divide and conquer. They would put one immigrant group against another to try to prevent that solidarity that the Wobblies talked about, right? Because you're worried about, well, look at how the Italians are being treated. They're being treated better than us Lithuanians, and that's not okay. And that's what usually happened. But every once in a while, immigrant strikes that could be a form of strength, right? This ethnic cohesiveness could be the basis of unity, just as well as it could be as of disunity. So when these new immigrants went on strike, what's being placed front and center was this idea of collective bargaining, this idea that collectively you could have a union saying, no, you have to give all workers a raise, as opposed to each individual worker having to go in and ask for one, right? This is kind of what collective bargaining is. And that's going to put the right of being able to do this collective bargain at the forefront of the reform agenda. And probably the most famous successful story of new immigrants on strike is going to be in Lawrence, Massachusetts, at a strike at a woolen mill. What had happened here was that the state legislature reduced the maximum hours that a person could work. And so the company reduced the pay of people who worked more. Not that they didn't work more, right? So the Massachusetts said, oh, you can only work X number of hours. So the people who worked beyond that, who worked, say, 3 hours past what they were supposed to, they still had to work it. They just weren't going to get paid for those 3 hours, is how this was. So you could understand why that would upset people. And it leads to a spontaneous strike, right? The workers get mad and they walk out. And this drags on. And eventually the workers decided that because they were, out of food and starving, because whenever these strikes happened, there was real potential for violence, they decided to send their children out of town for the duration of this strike. And so they put them on trains, and these children were going to go stay with socialist families in New York City. And as these children are getting off the train, most of them looked, hungry and starving and small and pathetic. And it was a big spectacle, right? The press got hold of it and are publishing these pictures. And eventually, the PR for this was so bad that the Massachusetts government decided to intervene on the workers' terms, which was very unusual. Usually the state always sided with management. But in this case, the public relations were so bad, these children were so pathetic, that they intervened on workers' terms. And this led to the slogan, "We want bread and roses too," for the labor movement, right? This idea that we want higher wages and the finer things in life. We want to be paid enough that we can have bread and roses, right? Not just bread. So labor is really going to be the group that is pushing this idea of civil liberties that we take for granted today. This idea of being able to demonstrate, to free speech. We assume that that's how it always was, but that was contested. And it was labor that won these rights for us. The right to strike, the right to free speech. All of these were significant issues in the progressive era and highly contested. And at first, the courts are going to be rejecting the claims of labor, that they have a right to demonstrate, that they have a right to free speech, that they have a right to strike. And labor's going to keep pushing it, especially the Wobblies. The Wobblies, we have to thank for a lot of these rights being affirmed. And through various forms of political activity, the labor movement will demand the right to assemble, demand the right to organize, demand the right to spread its views, demand the right to speak freely. And all of this is going to set the stage for the civil liberties to become the central component of freedom in the 20th century. And so it was the IWW especially that is going to be challenging these free speech laws by getting arrested and eventually forcing the courts to acknowledge that, yes, these are your rights. And so a lot of the rights we take for granted today were won for us by the labor unions at the turn of the century. So if you need to pause this video, please do so now. We also see new feminism emerging during this time period, which is expanding this definition of American freedom. So feminists' forthright attack on traditional rules of sexual behavior added a new dimension in this discussion for personal freedom. And probably Isadora Duncan is going to be the symbol of feminism in this era. Isadora Duncan was a dancer, and what she did was she shed her corset and she danced kind of freely. And you can Google her on YouTube and look at what she looks like dancing. And today we look at this in the era of twerking like, okay, this is pretty mild. But remember, this is a time when most women were still wearing corsets in which you cannot breathe. In fact, you cannot bend over, right? And so the fact that she took that off, she might as well have been running around naked, right? Because wearing a corset was what you did. And not doing so was pretty scandalous. And so the fact that she took it off and that she's dancing really kind of was an attack on this idea of these traditional roles of behavior, and especially sexual behavior for women. And so issues of intimate personal relations that previously would have been confined to private discussions, right, things that you would have never talked about publicly, started to blaze forth in popular magazines and in popular debates. Things like sexual intercourse, things like menstrual cycles, things like birth control, right? You would have never talked about that in public before. You would have barely talked about it with your mother. But now here it is, front and center for everybody to see. And it led to a lot of people feeling very anxious. Journalist William N. Reedy called it sex o'clock because it seemed to be in everybody's face. But feminism itself was associated with greater liberty, free sexual expression, and especially reproductive choice. And so the birth control movement really starts to take center stage here. In part, this is getting a kickstart because more and more women are in the workforce. And nothing is going to screw up your day at work than having to give birth, right? And then take care of a newborn for the next 6 to 8 weeks. And so more and more women in the workforce is going to reinforce demands for access to birth control. And you take this for granted today, but there were laws before the 1950s and 60s when these were challenged where birth control was illegal, or you needed your husband's permission to use birth control, etc. So this was not something like today where you just go to the doctor and get a prescription. There were laws against it, or laws controlling women. Women had to get somebody else's permission whether or not they could use birth control. But what this did, this talk and this demand for birth control, in addition to showing us that women are working more, it's also indicative of changing sexual behavior, where sex is no longer going to be viewed by society strictly for procreation, but instead now being accepted as a form of pleasure, and a form of pleasure that should be available to women and not just men. And so you see people like Emma Goldman lecturing on sexual freedom and advocating for access to birth control, something very different from something that her mother would have been saying, where certainly women didn't talk about sex, and if they did, they weren't supposed to be enjoying it, right? This was to make babies, and this was not something pleasurable that you were supposed to be doing just for fun. But nobody is going to place the issue of birth control front and center more than Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger put birth control at the heart of new feminism, saying that no woman could call herself free who does not control her own body and can choose consciously whether she will or will not be a mother. This is what she said. And so she will be challenging laws that banned contraception, challenging laws that banned contraceptive informations. There were laws that you couldn't even talk about contraception. And she's going to be the founder of Planned Parenthood. So Planned Parenthood goes back to here, and it's traced to new feminism and this idea that women should be allowed to control their own bodies, should be allowed to have information about birth control, should be allowed to use birth control if they want to, ultimately so that they can be allowed to have sex if they want to. Now, that being said, she does have a darker side, and that is that part of the reason why she's so gung-ho on birth control was she was really kind of concerned in a social Darwinistic kind of way about all these new immigrants coming in. And she felt like those people ought to not be having so many kids. So, with the good and the bad, right? But in 1911, Sanger is going to begin a column on sex education. And by 1914, she will have her own journal called The Woman Rebel. And it tells you a lot that she has to be a rebel to talk about women's bodies, to talk about women's issues. So if you need to pause this video to catch up on something, please do so now. Native Americans will not be left out of the progressive movement. In 1911, the Society of American Indians was founded as a reform organization, and it's significant because it was founded pretty much independent of white control. And so what it did was it brought together Native American intellectuals to try to figure out ways to remedy the injustices that Native Americans were facing during this time period. And of course, they didn't agree, right? Many of them supported the goals of the federal government of transforming communal reservations into individual family farms, and many of them didn't. So not a lot gets kind of decided, but the fact that this is a discussion taking place amongst Native Americans independent of white control is significant. Probably the most outspoken critic of all this is going to be Carlos Montezuma. He began to demand that all Indians be granted full U.S. citizenship. This was a time before they were. He also demanded that the Bureau of Indian Affairs be abolished. It was the Bureau of Indian Affairs that was managing basically Native American life, right? And he insisted that self-determination was the only way for Indians to escape poverty and marginalization, which was what was found on most reservations. He's going to be pretty controversial, and not all Native Americans bought into what he was saying, but he was definitely a critic of the status quo. If you need to pause this video, please do so now. We're now going to begin discussing the learning outcome, discuss in what ways progressivism included both democratic and anti-democratic impulses. Progressivism, again, was an international movement, as cities throughout the world experienced similar social strains from rapid industrialization and from urban growth. This is happening kind of everywhere. Cities are getting really, really big as they industrialize, and they're seeing similar problems. Now, European countries such as Germany and England are going to respond in different ways than what the United States did, which was to, I guess, pretend like it wasn't happening. England and Germany began things like old age pensions, minimum wage laws, unemployment insurance, and the regulation of workplace safety, which many progressives believed that the United States should emulate. And so this old world social legislation, by which they meant government action to address urban problems and the insecurities of working life, became a major part of the American political discourse during this time period. And it's going to be our progressives who are going to seek to reinvigorate the idea of an activist, socially conscious government that is going out trying to help the ordinary person, right? Who is concerned about social inequality, who is concerned about the health and welfare of its citizens, not necessarily just about laissez-faire, you get to make money. And progressives could now reject that old traditional assumption that a powerful government posed a threat to freedom, because their ideas of freedom itself were in flux, right? This is a time when what freedom meant was not agreed upon. You had the business owners saying it was freedom of contract, it was the freedom to make money, and others challenging it. And what they're challenging it with was varying. So one of the people that talked a lot about this was a philosopher named John Dewey. And John Dewey talked about what he called effective freedom. Effective freedom was a positive concept of freedom, not a negative concept. And I don't mean that in terms of good or bad. I mean in terms of, does it do something or does it not do something, right? If it's positive, it does something. If it's negative, it does not do something. So our Gilded Age industrialists had a negative view of freedom, that the government shall not interfere, the government shall not regulate, the government shall not do whatever. Dewey has a positive definition: the government shall. In other words, it has the power to do specific things. And Dewey argued that freedom sometimes meant that it required the government to act on behalf of those with little wealth or power. And so for Dewey and others who agreed with him, freedom itself became a political question, and something that more and more, especially the progressive presidents, begin to embrace. If we need to pause the video, please do so now. The first place we start to see a lot of change happening is going to be at the state and local level. State and local governments enacted most of the era's reform measures because it was more decentralized than in Europe, right? In Europe, everything is more kind of centralized into the power of the states, whereas in the United States, we're just one big hodgepodge of decentralized power. And that was done intentionally when it was set up, right? So nobody becomes tyrannical. But it does make making these big changes on a national level really, really difficult. And so that's why we see a lot of these reforms happening at the state and local level, as opposed to Europe, where it's happening nationwide. So in cities, we saw cities focusing on reducing the power of political bosses, people like Bosch Tweed. We also see them establishing public control of, quote, natural monopolies. In other words, places like things like the water company, the gas company, the electric company. You see that in the city of Laredo, for example, where when you pay your water bill, you pay it to the city. And you also see them trying to improve public transportation. In rural places, that's not very realistic, but if you go to big metropolitan areas like Washington, D.C., like New York City, public transit is the way most people get around. At the local level, they'll also be raising property taxes to pay for things like schools and parks and public facilities. And a good example of this in action is Hazen Pingree, who was the mayor of Detroit from 1889 to 1897. And he was a big kind of proponent of what he characterized as urban progressivism. And what he did was he fought for public utilities, this idea that utilities would be owned by the city and so not making a profit, but instead providing a service. And he also talked about, trying to balance that with business interests. Now, we also see progressivism in the West. As you know, the West, far less industrialized, far less urbanized than the East and in the North, but they're still doing a lot of stuff here. The former progressives and those who believed in the virtues of the frontier are the ones that were kind of focusing here. A good example of this is the Oregon system. The Oregon system included things like direct primaries. the initiative and the referendum, which enabled voters to propose and vote on their own laws, as well as the recall. And the idea behind all these things, the primary, the initiative, the referendum, was to sidestep politicians who many progressives felt like were corrupt, were in the pocket of big business. If you gave power to the people, then people could, in theory, pass their own laws that would sidestep these powerful corporate interests. A leading figure here was a man named William Irwin, and we're going to see the initiative used in the West for a lot of different things, right? For example, it's used to grant women's suffrage. So women are voting in the West well before they're voting in the North or in the South. And the Oregon system is going to emerge from an alliance of urban middle class and farmers and workers. And eventually it gets replicated in other states. That being said, fault lines appeared whenever they tried to use the referendum to increase taxes on the rich, for example, or provide jobs for the unemployed, both of which are going to fail, right? And in some cases, the initiative would become out of control, where they'd be kind of proposing stuff that was either detrimental to society overall or was never going to pass. That being said, it still exists, and it still remains an important way to kind of sidestep politicians who don't want to do things that most people in their state do. And you're going to see influential progressive administrations at the state level. These included people like Hiram Johnson from California, and most importantly, Robert La Follette, who made Wisconsin a, quote, laboratory for democracy. And so oftentimes when we talk about Robert La Follette, the shorthand we use is the Wisconsin idea, because the Wisconsin idea included things like nomination of cabinets for office through primary elections rather than through political bosses. It led to the taxation of corporate wealth. It led to state regulation of railroads and public utilities. And the ideas here drew on nonpartisan faculty members from the University of Wisconsin in order to staff La Follette's administration. So he wasn't somebody that embraced this idea of the common man knows everything. He was very much relying on experts. He was very much relying on elites. That being said, they were trying to do things that they felt would benefit society as a whole, as opposed to benefiting a particular corporate interest. If we need to pause this video to catch up on something, please do so now. So to argue that this concept of democracy was in flux, as well as the meaning of flux during this time period, is definitely true. But it's incorrect to characterize progressivism as kind of this straight line to more democracy and more freedom, right? Because reality is not a Disney cartoon. Reality is far more messy and complicated. And the progressives are both going to expand democracy in some cases, and they're going to contract it in others, right? Some will benefit and some will not. In general, progressives hope to reinvigorate democracy by restoring political power to the citizenry and to restore civic harmony to a divided society. But responsibility for government made them very anxious. They didn't want just anybody doing this. They wanted to make sure that the people that were in charge were people who were worthy of it. So they were not kind of this populist, everybody's equal and deserves an equal say kind of people, right? They're very much believers in experts and in elites. And while their goal may have been worthy, right, they certainly were not entirely inclusive. So we do see democracy both expand and contract. One way it expanded was through the passage of the 17th Amendment in 1913. The 17th Amendment allowed for the direct election of senators. In the original Constitution, United States senators were chosen by state legislatures, which means politicians got to choose the politicians, so you can imagine what kind of politician they chose, right? The idea of a direct election of senators where people vote directly for their United States senator was that hopefully people would elect maybe somebody that goes in there and shakes things up, who were not beholden to corporate interests, as opposed to the way it had been done. I'll let you judge for yourself whether or not that worked. We also see the introduction of elections for judges, popular election for judges. Um, we do this in various states. Texas does this, where you elect judges. The idea being that if you have a judge in there that makes bad decisions or is unfair, that the next time around you can throw them out and put somebody better in. We begin to see the use of primaries for elections. Prior to the primary, political bosses got to choose who the candidate would be. And of course, they're going to choose a candidate who will do what they're told, right? Who's beholden to the party bosses, who's beholden to the corporate interests that prop up the party. The idea being that if you have a primary, if you let the people choose, then they themselves will pick somebody who is not beholden to those interests. And very much you see this with the election of Donald Trump, right? Putting aside any Russian interference that helped him along, he certainly was not the favorite of the political establishment, and yet he got put into office anyway because he won the primary. So the results of this, I'll let you decide whether that's good or bad, but it certainly was effective, right? It did what it was intended to do. And of course, we have the 19th Amendment, which is passed in 1920, which granted women's suffrage. So on the whole, we see democracy expanding in various ways for various groups. But at the same time, democracy is also going to see numerous restrictions on participation during the Progressive era. The disenfranchisement of African Americans in the South is still going to continue. Remember what progressives did and what they didn't do, right? They're very, very concerned about the abuses of capitalism. They're less concerned about this idea of racial justice, right? They really are not interested in the plight of African Americans in the South. And so their systematic disenfranchisement will continue. You also see them replacing mayors in many places with appointed city managers or commissions. When they're doing this, again, it goes back to this idea of making sure that people who are running the government deserve to be running the government. So, anybody can get themselves elected as mayor. They may or may not be qualified. Let's put people in charge who are, smart and professional or whatever. And while that makes a certain kind of efficiency sense, it's kind of the opposite of democracy, right? Because you're not voting for somebody in, you're appointing somebody in. And we're also going to see a lot of barriers for poor people being put in place. And it comes with this kind of prejudice that even the progressives could not escape from the Gilded Age, this idea that if you are poor, you are somehow, there's some kind of character flaw there, right? You're either not smart enough or you're lazy or something's wrong with you if you happen to be poor. It's a prejudice that the progressives are unconsciously kind of carrying over, and I think to some degree carries over even to this day. And so they put barriers to the poor voting, things like the poll tax, things like residency requirements. And so voting came to be seen more as a privilege for the few as opposed to an obligation for the many, because progressives really did put faith in expertise. They really did want government by experts, not necessarily government by everybody. And so political freedom for progressives was less a matter of direct participation in government than of qualified persons devising the best public policies. They're very elitist and unapologetically so. If you need to pause this video to catch up on something, please do so now. Women are going to be some of our most important progressive reformers during this time period. Organized women reformers will be speaking for the more democratic side of progressivism as opposed to this more elitist side. And women especially will be focusing attention on the plight of the poor, especially on the plight of poor women and poor children. And one of the most important people here is Jane Addams. Jane Addams founded Hull House in Chicago, which was a settlement house. Settlement houses were usually run by women, and they were devoted to improving the lives of the immigrant poor. And so these women, there were hundreds of them throughout the country. Hull House is the most famous. But they would buy a house in the slums, right, in these immigrant neighborhoods, and they would move in and they would try to improve the lives of the poor there through things like classes, and they would provide soup kitchens and, job assistance if you needed help finding a job, childcare, some education, all this stuff. And these settlement houses were the first social workers. This is how social work gets invented. It got invented by these settlement houses. And so the women that are doing this are who we call new women. New women were college educated. That was very rare during this time period. During this time period, your average male got an 8th grade education. So the fact that she is a woman who graduated from college makes her pretty exceptional. She tended to be middle class, and she was very devoted to providing social services to the least of these, right, to the poor. And so even though you begin to see government becoming more activist as a result of this, because as much as the settlement tried, they couldn't fix inadequate housing in the city, right? They couldn't fix income inequality. They couldn't fix major healthcare issues. And they tried. And the fact that they were women gave them a certain moral authority. The fact that they were middle-class women gave them certain respectability. It ends up putting a lot of pressure on governments to address these problems that were too big for any one charity to solve. So settlement houses led to reforms in Chicago and eventually that are copied elsewhere. You will see the creation of building codes and of sanitation codes. You'll see laws requiring shorting worker hours, requiring worker safety. You'll see laws protecting the rights to unionize. And we see settlement houses producing many of the era's most important female reformers. And Jane Addams is one of them. Another one is a woman named Florence Kelley. Florence Kelley created the National Consumers League, which advocated for better working conditions for women and children. And of course, all of this fed into the campaign for women's suffrage. The campaign for women's suffrage was not new. It had been around since the early 19th century. Even Abigail Adams wrote to her husband, John Adams, while he's working on the Constitution to remember the ladies, and then he forgot. But this is when this becomes a mass movement. This is when it kicks into high gear. In the 1890s, this was kind of an elitist thing, but now in the progressive era, it shifted to this broad coalition from middle-class women to socialists to settlement workers to the elites. And you see this kind of, the most important organization that's leading this charge is the National Association of Women's Suffrage Associations, NASA. And NASA's membership grew exponentially during this time period. By 1900, over half the states allowed the women to vote in at least local elections dealing with school issues. And that wasn't good enough, because the way voting is determined even today is state by state by state. Each state gets to determine who gets to vote. And that's why anytime the federal government wanted to make changes to voting, say 18-year-olds are allowed to vote, it required a constitutional amendment, because otherwise it's a state power. And so NASA is going to spend a lot of time advocating for the right to vote on a state-by-state basis. So they would go into every state and lobby in every state. And by 1900, they've had some success, right? In half the states, women could vote on, say, local issues. But that wasn't good enough. And so eventually, we're going to see this movement increasingly focus on a constitutional amendment guaranteeing women the right to vote, which ultimately is achieved with the 19th Amendment. Now, ironically, the desire to exalt women's role within the home did a lot to inspire the reinvigoration of the suffragist movement. And we talk about this in terms of maternalist reforms, right? Because this idea that women were supposed to be the breadwinners, or not the breadwinners, but the domestic caretakers, that they were supposed to be the ones taking care of their families and nurturing their families and creating wonderful, relaxing, peaceful homes. Ironically, this gives a boost to the suffragist movement, because what they were able to do was play on these assumptions, right? Essentially, we're going to see a mass movement for improving the living standards of the poor, mothers, and children get launched. And we're going to see laws that provided for a mother's pension spread. And these maternist reforms rested on the assumption that the government should encourage women's capacity for bearing and raising children and enable them to be economically independent too. And this was a win-win, right? Because this was something for everybody. Feminists and traditionalists liked these kinds of reforms for different reasons, albeit. But this idea that the government needed to be protecting the living standards of women and children appealed to everybody for different reasons. And you see this, for example, in the Supreme Court case Muller v. Oregon in 1908. This upheld the constitutionality of an Oregon law which set maximum working hours for women. And the thinking behind this was that it was following this tradition that women were a dependent group, like children, right? And because of that, they were entitled to special protection in the way that men were not. And Louis Brandeis, who by this time is the Supreme Court Justice, his brief, or not yet a Supreme Court Justice, but is writing on the case, brief relied on scientific studies showing women were physically weaker than men. And because of that, argued that the government had an interest in them bearing children and keeping them physically fit. And thus, the government had a legitimate interest in their working conditions. And so, this idea then is the first kind of crack in that freedom of contract argument, right? In that liberty of contract that, you know, the government shouldn't tell, if two people are making a contract, I agree to work for you, I agree to pay you this much, that the government shouldn't get involved in that. This is a crack in that, because here's the government saying you can't make women work however many hours. But this breach in the liberty of contract doctrine did have a high cost for women, because the same time that women were entering the labor market and earning college degrees, the court, the government, solidified the view that women workers were weak, were dependent, were not capable of enjoying the same economic rights as men. And so this breach in the liberty of contract was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, women were given protections that men of the time deserved but were not given. But on the other hand, it made them into this kind of special class where they're being characterized as weak and not capable. That being said, this is where the foundations of the welfare state were laid. Eventually, the idea will spread that maybe the government should be concerned about the conditions of men too, right? Maybe nobody should be working 80 hours a week for starvation wages. And Brandeis and many eventually envisioned kind of universal economic entitlements, such as a decent income, such as accident and unemployment insurance. That being said, during this time period, most laws regulating wages and regulating working hours only applied to women and children. Regulating men, making men have a minimum wage, limiting their hours, was still viewed by many as interfering with that freedom of contract, which is going to still hold sway. If you need to pause this video to catch up on something, please do so now. We're now going to talk about the learning outcome, analyze how progressive presidents fostered the rise of the nation state. Really, the first progressive president that we talk about is Theodore Roosevelt, TR. And he became president in September of 1901 after President McKinley was assassinated. And Roosevelt's domestic program was called the Square Deal. The Square Deal attempted to confront the problems caused by economic consolidation by distinguishing between, quote, good and, quote, bad corporations. Good corporations, at least according to Roosevelt, were things like Standard Oil and U.S. Steel. He argued that these helped the public. And bad corporations were run by greedy people, right? Were not helping the public. Now, what's the criteria, you may ask, as to helping the public and not helping the public? I have no idea. It was whatever Teddy Roosevelt kind of came up with in his head. It's not like anybody sat down and systematically thought this through and came up with the thing. But at least the very fact that he's distinguishing that there are bad corporations out there that were run by greedy people is a lot different from what we saw in the Gilded Age, where it was kind of laissez-faire, everything goes. And so Roosevelt is going to be using the Sherman Antitrust Act for the first time. This act had existed since the late 1800s, but had never been used before to break up a company. When it was used, it was to break up a union. For the first time, Roosevelt is going to use this, and is going to use it to dissolve the Northern Securities Company. This was a company that was created by J.P. Morgan, and it directed the stocks of 3 major railroad companies and was essentially a monopoly. And he used this act to break it up for the first time, which is a big deal, right? This is a major break from everything that we saw in the Gilded Age, where it was very laissez-faire, nobody can tell me how to run my business, monopolies are good. And here, for the first time, the federal government is saying, no, I have a right to regulate this economic opportunity, and I have a right to do it in the public interest of the people. Roosevelt will also improve the International Chamber of Commerce, the ICC, as well as regulate the food and drug industry. And these are really radical changes, and he's helped along by all the stuff that's been happening during this time period. He's helped along by that labor unrest, those major strikes that turned violent, right? It gives weight to his argument that, hey, I need to do something to help fix these conditions. He's helped along by those muckrakers, those journalistic exposés, especially the jungle, right, to regulate food, those pictures of those working children. And he's helped along by those progressive reformers who largely back this idea of regulating capital. And so we also see in 1906 him pass the Hepburn Act. The Hepburn Act gave the ICC the power to regulate railroads. This was a pretty big deal. Gone are the days now of laissez-faire where you can do whatever you want, railroad companies. Now the federal government is coming in and regulating. And he's also going to begin calls for a federal inheritance and income tax. And this was designed to lessen that income inequality. The biggest con that businesses and the rich ever did was to convince the average person that taxes are bad, right? Taxes are bad for rich people, but taxes are generally good for poor and middle class people because the tax money is used to help them in theory, right? It's used to build roads, which middle class and poor people rely on. Rich people can take a helicopter. It's used to fund schools that middle class and poor people use. Rich people hire a private tutor. It's helped to provide health care for middle and poor people. Rich people don't need that. They have a private physician. So the fact that they're starting to go after these uber rich and saying you need to give back to society, you need to help lessen the inequality that we see by allowing the underclass to go to school and be educated, to allow them to be healthy, to allow them to have access to infrastructure. That's all very, very radical. We also see conservation being really important under Theodore Roosevelt's administration. Theodore Roosevelt himself was an avid outdoorsman. He was a big hunter. He shot everything that existed, I think. I love this meme, right? You may think you're cool, but you'll never be Teddy Roosevelt riding a moose in a river cool, which is probably true. John Muir is going to be one of the people that's going to be leading this charge. John Muir developed a broad following for his evangelical romanticization of nature. He is the one that's going to create the Sierra Club in the 1890s to combat logging. We're going to see national parks get created during this time period. This is when that gets invented. The United States led the world in efforts to preserve the nature of beauty, natural beauty. For example, Yellowstone National Park is created in 1872, both to preserve this so future generations, get to see nature when it felt like most of the country was becoming an industrialized parking lot. but also with the idea of tourism in mind. And even to this day, Yellowstone remains a big tourist attraction. We also begin to see in the 1890s Congress begin regulating economic development of, quote, forest reserves. But it's going to be President Roosevelt that makes conservation really federal policy. And he will be setting aside thousands of acres for wildlife reserves, for national parks. And this was also reflected in progressive reforms using scientific planning. You see, for example, this reflected in Gifford Pinchot, who was the head of the U.S. Forest Service. He believed that development and conservation could go hand in hand, that you didn't have to get rid of one without the other. And it was this idea that you could develop in a controlled way, that forests could be controlled, not eliminated. And that's something that until very recently was something that was pretty non-controversial in the U.S. government. It doesn't start to really become controversial until probably the 80s and 90s. If you need to pause this video, you can do so now. Following Roosevelt, Roosevelt's hand-picked successor, William Howard Taft, is going to enter office. He's in office from 1908 until 1912. And Taft is going to pursue this antitrust policy even more aggressively than Roosevelt did. He will be persuading the Supreme Court to declare Standard Oil in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1911, and he ends up breaking it up. Standard Oil was such a massive company that it broke up into over 10 companies, smaller companies. He was also against big tobacco. He was a supporter of the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, which authorized Congress to enact a graduated income tax. In other words, graduated meaning poor people pay less than rich people do. And he used that income tax as a reliable and flexible source of revenue for the national state. It's here, though, that progressive Republicans though, are going to break from Taft after what's called the Ballinger-Pinchot affair. Taft's Secretary of the Interior was a guy named Richard A. Ballinger, and he ruled that Roosevelt did not have the power to place land in forest reserves. And so he decided to return some of this land to the public domain. So why does he want to return this land to public domain? Well, because lumber companies, mining companies, oil companies wanted it, right? And so he's giving this over so that it can be exploited. Now, Gifford Pinchot, who again was the head of the U.S. Forest Service, accused Ballinger of colluding with business interests and hurting the environment, which he was, right? But Taft decided to side with Ballinger, and he fired Pinchot in 1910, and it's here where this breach with the progressives was totally fixed. So in response to this, and in response to the trust busting where he broke up Standard Oil, which, remember, Teddy Roosevelt had called a, quote, good trust, right? Those two things were a bridge too far for Teddy Roosevelt. And Teddy Roosevelt and Taft are going to get into a very public and nasty man fight. So much so to the point that Teddy Roosevelt is going to launch an independent campaign for president and create a new party. This new party was called the Progressive Party. It's also sometimes called the Bull Moose Party after Teddy Roosevelt. And Roosevelt's doing it specifically so he can run for president against Taft. So if you need to pause this video to catch up on something, please do so now. So this leads us then to the election of 1912. The election of 1912 was a four-way contest between William Howard Taft, Theodore Roosevelt, the Democrat Woodrow Wilson, and the socialist Eugene V. Debs. And it became a national debate on the relationship between political and economic freedom in this age of big business. Now, Taft is going to be stressing economic individualism as the foundation of social order, but qualifying it with this belief that there should be moderate government intervention. So he's not going all the way to, the state should be controlling everything. He's still embracing a lot of those freedom of contract ideas, but he's modifying it, right? He's moderating it. At the other end of the spectrum was Eugene V. Debs, who wanted to eventually abolish the capitalist system, but in the immediate term, he wanted to immediately seize the railroads and banking system into public ownership and use the government to aid the unemployed and create a minimum wage. So these two weren't really the big contenders here. The real battle was between Wilson and Roosevelt. And there too, the role of the federal government in securing economic freedom was the main issue. Now, both of them did believe that the government was necessary, but they differed over how the government should be intervening and how much the government should be intervening. So Wilson's plan was called New Freedom and New Nationalism. New Freedom. Teddy Roosevelt's was called New Nationalism. So Wilson's New Freedom insisted that democracy must be reinvigorated by restoring market competition and by freeing government from the domination of big business. And he was heavily influenced by the ideas of Brandeis. He was worried both about big government and about big business, right? So he's kind of a minimalist in this sense. So New Freedom promised to strengthen antitrust laws, to protect the right of workers to unionize, to encourage small businesses. And it warned that, quote, corporations were as likely to corrupt government as to be managed by it, unquote. I'll leave it to you to whether or not you think that that's true. Roosevelt's New Nationalism, by contrast, called for heavy taxes on personal and corporate fortunes. And it also called for federal regulation of industries, including railroads, mining, and oil. And finally, kind of third big player here was the Progressive Party platform, which offered numerous proposals to promote social justice. It was drafted, among others, by settlement house activists, and it laid out this blueprint for a modern democratic welfare state with everything from women's suffrage to the 8-hour day to social insurance for unemployment, medical care, and old age. So if you need to pause this, you can do so now. So the fact that you had Teddy Roosevelt running and William Howard Taft running meant that the Republican vote ends up splitting. And so Wilson will win with only 42% of the popular vote. Teddy Roosevelt received 27%, Taft won 23%. So if you add those together, you can see that actually the Republican policies were probably more popular. But they split, right? And Wilson wins with 42% of the popular vote. And Wilson himself is going to prove himself as a very strong executive leader. The Democrats had also won control in Congress. And so because there was unified government, Wilson is going to move aggressively to implement his version of progressivism by passing a bunch of legislation. One thing he passed was the Underwood Tariff. This reduced duties on imports and imposed a graduated income tax on the richest 5% of Americans to make up for the lost money. He passed the Clayton Antitrust Act in 1914. This exempted labor unions from antitrust laws, and it barred courts from issuing injunctions curtailing the right to strike. So a very labor-friendly move. Pretty 180 from the Gilded Age. He passed the Keating-Owen Child Labor Act in 1916. This outlawed child labor in the manufacturing of goods sold in interstate commerce. So children under 16 are no longer allowed to work in those manufacturing. That's why if you wanted to get a job, you had to wait until you were 16. The Adamson Act of 1916, this established an 8-hour workday on the nation's railroads. So note, this is limited to a specific industry, but over time this does spread. And finally, he passed the Warehouse Act in 1916. This extended credit to farmers when they stored their crops in federally licensed warehouses. And this reflected those populist sub-treasury plans, right? It was kind of a play on that. So under Wilson, the role of the federal government does expand, but in different ways than what we saw under Roosevelt and Taft. Wilson is going to be abandoning the idea of aggressive trust busting in favor of greater government supervision of the economy. One way he does this is through the Federal Reserve System in 1913. The Federal Reserve System created 12 regional banks that were overseen by a central board, which was appointed by the president, and it was empowered to handle the issuance of currency, aid banks in danger of failing, and influence treasury rates. And of course, this is still around today. This is the Fed, right? Whenever you hear them talk about the Fed raising rates, that's who they're talking about. He also created the Federal Trade Commission in 1914, the FTC, which is also still around. The Federal Trade Commission was supposed to investigate and prohibit, quote, unfair business activities, things like price fixing and monopolistic practices. And that's still around today. If you want to merge your company with another, oftentimes you have to petition the FTC for permission to do it. And believe it or not, many businesses supported this as a way of providing order and staving off some of the more extreme measures that we saw taking place in the Gilded Age, kind of the end of the Wild Wild West. While some bemoaned it, many others supported it because it did bring to the economy a level of stability and a level of kind of even playing field where everybody knew the rules. So if you need to pause this, you may go so now. So in this lecture, the 4 outcomes that we worked on was identifying why the city was such a central element in progressive America. We analyzed how the labor and women's movements expanded the meanings of American freedom. We discussed in what ways progressivism included both democratic and anti-democratic impulses. And we analyzed how the progressive presidents fostered the rise of the nation